Following the war, the debate over the proper status of African Americans would continue. Would they truly become equal citizens in the United States? There was also the question of what was to become of the South as a whole. Would these states simply be readmitted to the Union, or would they have to fundamentally change in some way before they could be accepted back? These questions involve not only a continuing power struggle between the North and the South, but also an institutional struggle between the presidency and Congress. Very early in the war, Lincoln had made it clear that he believed the presidency should be primarily responsible for the Reconstruction of the South. Eager to end the strife as quickly as possible, he devised a lenient plan to bring the Southern states back into the Union. Under this proposal, if a former rebel state acknowledged the end of slavery and 10% of the population swore loyalty to the Republic, it would immediately regain its full status. Congress objected, demanding that the rebels recognize not only the end of slavery, but also a guarantee of equal rights for African Americans. They insisted as well that a full majority of the population swear loyalty. Lincoln refused to sign this measure, known as the Wade-Davis Bill, and it was never enacted. The assassination of President Lincoln in April of 1865 put a new twist on this disagreement. Andrew Johnson had been nominated as Lincoln's vice president in the election of 1864 in order to placate Northern Democrats and the slaveholding border states. Johnson, a Democratic senator from Tennessee, had emphasized his hatred of the entrenched planter class in the South, and when the war broke out, he insisted that it was this planter elite who had led the South into a disastrous war. Throughout the conflict, he had firmly supported the Lincoln administration as a war Democrat. Johnson's plan for the restoration of the Union largely mirrored Lincoln's. In addition to 10% of the population swearing loyalty to the Union, the Southern states had to renounce the right of secession, deny the debts acquired under the Confederacy, and approve the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which ended slavery. With Congress in recess, Johnson put this plan into operation. The Southern states, however, resisted even these mild terms. 2 states failed to repudiate the right to secede. 2 refused to deny the debts of the Confederacy, and 2 rejected the 13th Amendment. All of the former Confederate states also adopted black codes that imposed severe restrictions on the rights of African Americans, including denying them the right to vote. Despite these gestures of defiance, President Johnson accepted the readmission of the former Confederate states. Emboldened by the president's sympathetic stance, the Southern states held elections for Congress that signaled their continuing defiance. Half of the senators and representatives they sent to Washington were former officials or officers of the Confederacy, including Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy. Why did Johnson tolerate this? In part, this reflected his agreement with Lincoln that the Union should be reconstructed as quickly as possible, but there were other factors as well. Despite his opposition to the Confederacy, Johnson was in every other way a traditional Southern Democrat. He firmly believed in a limited federal government and states' rights, arguing that the states should be given great latitude in controlling their own internal affairs. As a former slaveholder, he had little interest in the rights of African Americans, continuing to regard them as unworthy of full citizenship. Johnson also recognized that his political future was very precarious. While he had been elected on a Republican ticket, he had little support in the Republican Party. He thus hoped to cultivate the support of Southern Democrats in a bid for a second term as president. Many Northerners were deeply disturbed by these events. After a long and bloody conflict, it seemed as though the South was stubbornly refusing to admit their defeat, or change in any significant way, that the sacrifice of Union soldiers had been in vain. When the Republican-dominated Congress reconvened in December of 1865, they refused to seat the new Southern delegates and began to craft their own plan of Reconstruction. Their first object was to counter the black codes with legislation which would offer some protection to African Americans. In 1866, they reauthorized the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency which had worked in the South to aid former slaves and help protect them from abuse. That same year, they passed a Civil Rights Act, which sought to guarantee that African Americans would have the rights offered to all American citizens. President Johnson promptly vetoed both laws, but congressional Republicans were able to muster the two-thirds majority necessary to enact them anyway. Recognizing that they needed to do more, the Republicans proposed changing the Constitution. The 14th Amendment set forth several provisions. It affirmed that all people born in the United States were citizens and that no state could violate their rights as citizens. This was a direct response to the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision in 1857, which had asserted that African Americans, free or slave, were not citizens of the United States. It was also designed to forbid state efforts to discriminate against African Americans, such as the black codes passed in the South. The 14th Amendment also forbade the election or appointment to federal or state offices of anyone who had previously broken their oath to support the Constitution, engaged in rebellion. This provision sought to prevent the South from simply restoring the leadership of the old Confederacy under a new guise. It further stipulated that the debts of the Confederacy were null and void. Finally, it stipulated that if any state denied the right to vote of any male citizen 21 years or older, that state's representation in Congress would be proportionally reduced. Note that this did not guarantee that African Americans would have the right to vote. It simply indicated that any state that did so would have to pay a political penalty. President Johnson responded by forming a new political party based upon opposition to the 14th Amendment. He hoped that a racist backlash against its provisions would enable his new party to win control of Congress in 1866. However, Johnson had badly misread the Northern mood. While many white Northerners were not terribly sympathetic to the plight of African Americans, they were still bitterly angry at the South. As one Republican explained, Southern whites, quote, with all their intelligence, were traitors. The blacks, with all their ignorance, were loyal, unquote. The election of 1866 returned even larger Republican majorities to Congress. At the same time, only one former Confederate state agreed to ratify the 14th Amendment. With this fresh demonstration of Southern defiance, congressional Republicans decided to take even more drastic measures. The remaining 10 former Confederate states were organized into 5 military districts, each commanded by a general. Backed by federal troops, the military commanders were to oversee the formation of conventions to rewrite the state constitutions. No former Confederate officials would be allowed to participate, and the rights of African Americans to vote would be guaranteed. Once these new constitutions were approved and the states ratified the 14th Amendment, then they would be readmitted to the Union. President Johnson, however, continued to battle with Congress. He vetoed the military Reconstruction bill, only to have his veto instantly overridden. Johnson persisted in obstructing the Reconstruction effort in every way possible. Using his power as commander of the Army, he replaced military commanders in the South who were attempting to implement the congressional plan with those who supported the president's views. Congress, in turn, tried to curb President Johnson's authority over the military by passing the Command of the Army Act, which limited the president's ability to issue orders directly to commanders in the field, and the Tenure of Office Act. This last measure sought to protect one particular cabinet officer, Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton. Stanton was extremely sympathetic to congressional Reconstruction, and President Johnson was thus eager to remove him. The Tenure of Office Act stipulated that the president needed the approval of the Senate to fire any cabinet officer, just as it needed its approval to appoint them. When Congress refused to approve Secretary Stanton's dismissal, Johnson removed him anyway. Determined to end President Johnson's obstruction, the House of Representatives issued an article of impeachment against him, charging him with having violated the Tenure of Office Act. While many eagerly cheered for the dismissal of the stubborn president, others were worried about the constitutional implications. If Congress succeeded in removing the president, would they aggressively use this tool in the future to ensure absolute congressional control over the government? Would the presidency simply become a rubber stamp for the wishes of Congress? When Johnson's trial took place in the Senate, these considerations weighed heavily upon the thoughts of many senators, and it was precisely for this reason that the Republican senator from Kansas defied his party and cast the deciding vote against the president's conviction. Even with Johnson's opposition, military Reconstruction continued, and by 1870 the last of the former Confederate states had been readmitted to the Union.